Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we still have people joining the call, but I think in the interest of time, it's important to get started. So welcome to the CDW webinar covering the topic of addressing security and privacy in your remote learning platform. A couple of housekeeping items. All lines are muted, but you are encouraged to help us make this an interactive session by submitting questions through the Q&A or the chat box, and I'll be happy to interrupt our speakers. Today's session will be recorded and distributed to all participants, as well as posted to CDW Canada's YouTube channel. We have an all CDW cast for you today. Alistair McLeod, CDW Education Strategist, will open by adding relevance to today's discussion. Owen Dykstra, CDW Solution Architect, will discuss operational best practices for educators and then configuration best practices for IT professionals. Next, Tolu, CDW Collaboration Architect, will discuss specifically how Zoom has addressed privacy concerns through 2020, as well as some more platform agnostic aspects. And then Anthony Kahn, CDW Cyber Risk Team Lead, will discuss CDW's privacy and security assessments. Finally, we'll close with a reminder on some of this education sector-specific resources that CDW has published this year as a response to supporting the sector during what's been an incredibly challenging year. And as mentioned, I am encouraging you to bring discussion to today's session, as your questions or commentary will make it a more valuable session for all of our participants. And there was one question that came in actually in advance of the session, and that was, does this also apply to Google Meet? So I just want to address that now, that yes, this is a platform agnostic session. And with that, over to you, Alistair.
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit about why this topic of video collaboration security is an important one for us to discuss today. As we all know and have experienced, there's a lot more synchronous learning in hybrid classrooms occurring across the province of Ontario and in Canada. So we have students who are attending classes in person, and at the same time, students who are attending remotely into the same classroom. So that creates some significant privacy and security issues to be considered. So that's one of the reasons for our webinar today. Students and educators, of course, are collaborating outside of protected networks. So you have the case where you've both got educators and students who don't have the normal security policies and procedures in place that would be in place within the school board's regular network or protected network. We do, of course, have to meet privacy legislation compliance in Canada with whatever we do in education. So that's another thing to consider when we're looking at video collaboration. There have been a number of concerns raised by teaching federations. A lot of those occurred in April when video collaboration first got going, and it was kind of under unplanned, I guess, circumstances. Now the planning has been a lot better since the fall, so I haven't seen as many of those teacher federation concerns, but there were some concerns raised about protecting teacher privacy in particular, and there were some recent concerns raised in Upper Canada District School Board about live streaming classrooms raised by both teacher unions and parents as well. So there's some things there. The Ontario College of Teachers actually has published some video conferencing guidelines for educators as well. So another reason to take a look at how do we protect both student and teacher privacy when using remote learning. And there were, of course, some privacy concerns with the Zoom platform, specifically in the spring of 2020. And we'll be talking about what Zoom has done since then to try and shore up their systems and ensure that privacy is protected. In the province of Ontario, if we could go to the next slide, there is Policy Program Memorandum 164, which was published in August of 2020. And I've included just a few of the highlights there from that Policy Program Memorandum, and there's a link to it in the slide deck if you don't have access to it. So there is a requirement, according to that memorandum, that synchronous learning platforms do include live video, audio, and chat features and be fully accessible to students. So we certainly, that's an expectation that those are provided. And so we need to take a look at why, how to secure those and how to ensure privacy when they are provided, as well as some other tools that could be included, such as virtual whiteboards, recording features. We'll be talking about that. Participant polling and file uploading and sharing features. So quite a few features that would be new to some educators in using with students. And so we want to take a look at how to make sure that privacy is protected in those cases. There is a specific mention that clear protocols and procedures must be in place in school districts to ensure student safety and security during remote learning. And there's one of the best practices that's mentioned specifically in the memorandum is that teachers would be the last ones to leave synchronous learning sessions, and that students and teachers are aware of and respect board policies regarding digital conduct and privacy. So those are kind of the things we're going to be talking about in our session. And we're going to start with Owen, who's going to specifically refer to operational best practices for educators. So over to you, Owen.
Thanks, Alistair. So I just wanted to start by saying, obviously, one of the biggest challenges we have with adding additional security around a lot of these platforms is that they are all software as a service platforms, and they're cloud hosted and designed with security in mind. So my talk will be less about the security around the actual solution and more about the secure use. And some of this may be, we're well into, several months into virtual learning and virtual classrooms. So some of this may seem fairly obvious, but I think it's important to point a lot of these out. To start with, being able to control access to your classroom is very important, obviously, or to a meeting in general. So we strongly suggest, and it's best practice for all of these collaboration platforms, to use some sort of waiting room to queue your students in before you allow access into the room, and that allows you to make sure that you are present before your students come in. But it also prevents unwanted. It's another way to prevent unwanted people from coming in, and most of these platforms, it's referred to as a waiting room. With WebEx, which is the system we're using right now, it's a setting called, do not join before, or do not allow join before host. It's a setting we use here at CDW. It's a setting we strongly recommend all of our customers in any sector use. One of the things that Tolu is going to discuss, one of the security concerns that came out with Zoom in the spring was around Zoom bombing and having people, unauthorized people coming into your meetings. And one of the ways that one of the best tools we have to prevent that is not using your personal room IDs for classes, for meetings, for any sort of sessions, because those IDs tend to stay static, and any sort of static ID or static meeting ID gives an attacker, gives a bad actor, an opportunity to guess that, to hack it if it gets published or put on a public-facing social media site, or even within an intranet within the school. It can allow unauthorized people in. So very important to use unique meetings for unique IDs for each of these meetings or classes. Please generate a new one for each individual session. Alistair had mentioned, part of the mandate from the province of Ontario is to allow access to some of these collaborative features that are available within these platforms, whether it's annotation or whiteboarding. As a best practice, it's a good idea to disable these and then enable them as necessary, right? We're looking at that to prevent mischief, to prevent cheating. Any sort of unauthorized use of those tools that could cause a distraction to the class or any sort of disturbance. And that includes screen sharing. I can think of a number of different areas, or a number of different times where screen sharing can be very useful, especially if you have students collaborating together. But again, having that locked down and controlled, so that a student can only share a screen with permission from the teacher, and be able to turn that on and off as necessary. Also very important, when we're talking about privacy, is disabling the ability of participants to record sessions. Session recording should only be done by the meeting owner or the teacher in this case. And all meetings, all recorded meetings, all recorded classes should have a password assigned to that as well. That is, kept by the teacher and distributed as necessary. One of the, moving down the list, a very important best practice that I see a lot of people I speak to not adhering to is only sharing the application that you wish to present and not your entire screen. And especially I could think of for teachers, this is very important if you have a chat box pop up or an email preview come up that could contain some sensitive information about a student or personally sensitive information that wouldn't be for the eyes of your pupils. Very important, and that can be if you're moving between several applications, that can be a little bit cumbersome. But once you get in the flow of it, of stopping sharing and then sharing out the next application, it becomes very second nature. And as I mentioned, there's several risks. You could accidentally, switch to a document that is not supposed to be shared, right? Somebody can screenshot that or record some information off of that. And then just as a caveat, just be mindful when you are just sharing an application. If you do have other windows popping on top of those, sometimes it can interfere with what is being displayed underneath it. So just be mindful of that while you're doing it. But just going back on that, very important to only share the application and not share your entire screen. And then just a good practice to periodically audit your classroom. Make sure that somebody, that the participants that are in there are the ones that are supposed to be, that nobody else has snuck in or found a way in, and remove any of your unwanted guests. And then lastly, on this particular slide, going to the last point in Alistair's previous slide, the teachers are to be the last ones to leave the room. So it's very important to make sure that you end the meeting and not leave the meeting. Leaving a meeting can leave it hanging and can allow participants to continue in that session without you. So next slide, Jen. And then on the back end for configuration, and we've had a number of conversations about some of the challenges in the education sector. And for me as a security professional, one of the places where I know that I know is not as available in the education space that we use commonly is second factor or multi-factor authentication. And in the school board environment where single sign-on is being used exclusively, without having some sort of second factor in place, strong passwords become vitally important. Long gone are the days where where an 8-character password was sufficient. With today's technology, we can tear through 8-character, or an attacker, a bad actor, can tear through an 8-character password in a matter of seconds now. So, especially in these environments, for the educators and for the administrators that are using these systems, the longer and stronger a password can be, the better. And it's even more relevant where second factor authentication, where 2-factor authentication is not happening. So on that front, we do recommend a minimum of a 12-character password, with the standard strong factors, right? Uppercase, lowercase, alphanumeric, and symbols. And then, as I touched on the previous slide, enforcing passwords on recordings to prevent unauthorized access to those recordings. And then just further chatting about SSO, right? Wherever we have SSO, and again, wherever we have this and multi-factor authentication is not in place, just be mindful of the fact that there's a single point of attack. So having these, making sure that only the required applications are available to each individual, and making sure that that SSO portal is secured as strongly as possible, whether that's through strong passwords, or if and when multi-factor authentication becomes available to educators, utilizing that as well. Because the last thing you want is a threat actor getting a hold of your SSO portal and then having access to all of the applications behind it, including your video collaboration tools. So I think on that note, we hand things over to Tolu. Tolu, you're on mute.
Oh, sure, definitely. Thank you, Owen, for talking along those lines. And I'm just going to pick up things from where you stopped. When the pandemic began and lockdowns were initiated across the world, right? A lot of us, educators, even in corporate offices, we had to go back to a point where we needed a way to continue with life as usual. Businesses had to go on, classrooms had to be held, and we were not all familiar with the intricacies of this new situation that we found ourselves. However, we realized that we could use applications like WebEx, Zoom, Google Hangouts for our meetings. During that period, Zoom became the most popular. It became the de facto mode for communication. Meetings became synonymous to let's jump on a Zoom call, even though you're using a different client in that situation. It was let's jump on a Zoom call. And that was because Zoom was quite popular for everyone to use at that point in time. A couple of concerns were raised at the point where users started to use Zoom, and Zoom came out to clarify and to fix most of these situations. This slide particularly was gotten from Zoom, where they kind of curated the different security concerns that happened over the period of the pandemic, when these concerns were disclosed and when they were fixed, and description as to how this was fixed. One of the most popular one was Zoom bombing, right? Zoom bombing was a situation where uninvited guests would just pop into your meetings to share lewd images or to even share content during meetings. And this was possible because in the K-12 space and the education space, we have kids that are quite enthusiastic about this new platform they're getting on, and someone copies a meeting invite that is meant for a classroom and shares them on social media platform. And and some teachers in some cases did not lock these meetings or didn't understand the entire security features and capabilities that were built into Zoom, and people bombed or came into this meeting and did all sorts. And if you look at this slide, it says all of this was fixed by best security practices. Security practices by enabling or disabling who can have access to certain features in your meetings. I take screen sharing, for example. If you were in a classroom as an educator, one of the features that you probably want to take into consideration is to turn off video for everyone. You don't necessarily want to see everyone, especially the students. However, if it's a requirement for you to see a particular student, you can elect for them to turn on their cameras. You also want to control who can share what during your meetings. And all those features and capabilities are built into Zoom by default already. And which brings me to another point along those lines is adoption. How do we handle adoption within our organization today? Are teachers or educators being properly trained on how to use this tool? Another feature, another thing that was of major concerns was routing of data to China, and I'm going to touch on those in the next couple of slides. One other thing was end-to-end encryption. Most meetings today, as a matter of fact, are not encrypted end-to-end. However, there's a significant degree of encryption that is applied to meetings today. So I take this meeting we are in today, for example, which is a WebEx meeting. All of your encryption and all of that happens from your PC and all the way, and it gets decrypted when it gets into WebEx Cloud, and it gets encrypted when it leaves WebEx Cloud and all of that. End-to-end encryption actually limits a lot of features and capabilities that we would have in a standard meeting, and that is why most meetings don't really put a lot of emphasis on end-to-end encryption. However, security best practices are being applied to our meetings as they traverse from our computers into the cloud of whatever meeting platform we're using, and when it gets to the far end, in this case, your own PC where you're viewing this webinar. So Zoom kind of came out with with a statement to clarify what they meant by end-to-end encryption. Because in the cases where someone is joining from a mobile phone, they don't have control over traffic coming from a mobile phone into the Zoom meeting. However, they've put in new features and capabilities to ensure that a large degree of encryption is applied when users join meetings, so that we can feel safe and our students can feel safe when they join these meetings. I know that this slide deck will be shared after this meeting, so you can also have access to this information and update yourself about what Zoom has done or is doing to fix these issues. Next slide, please, Jan. So talking about routing data to China. So when the pandemic broke out, or when it became obvious that the whole world was going to go into a lockdown, there was significant request for there was significant increase in the number of meetings that were being held in the world generally. Again, what were one-on-one meetings or what were boardroom meetings were now replaced by Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings, as the case may be. In the case of Zoom, in a bid to respond to this as quickly as possible, they spun up a couple of data centers, right? And they started with China. Being the fact that the lockdown or the situation started with China, they started with China. However, from one of the statements, from what they've claimed or from the statement that Zoom has put out, they did not fully implement geofencing, right? Which would mean that if a meeting was starting in the US or in Canada, for example, that traffic shouldn't go out of that region to China. So in situations where they had reached capacity in Canada, for example, or in the US, they would overflow that meeting to data centers in China, right? As a result, it was possible for certain meetings. It is possible for certain meetings that were allowed to to be connected to systems in China, which shouldn't have been. As part of the security program, Zoom announced in April that Zoom now allows customers to specify locations where data will be routed to and opt out of certain locations where they don't want data to go to. Next slide, please, Jan. So fixing this, right? Paid Zoom customers will be able to customize your data center. So at the admin level, for example, you will be able to customize what you want your data center to look like, what regions you want your traffic to go to. A lot of people are kind of wary of traffic going to China and all of that. But if you're okay with your traffic touching data centers in Europe or touching data centers in Latin America, you can have that enabled. And if you want your data center, if you want your traffic to remain within Canada and North America, you can have that enabled by default. One of the things you cannot do is that you cannot opt out of your home data center location. For most customers, home data center would be where you're buying your Zoom licenses from. So if you're buying your Zoom licenses from Canada as a Canadian customer, Canada will be your home data center and you would not be able to opt out of that default region. So next, I'm just going to show you a brief overview of what the Zoom data center spread looks like. So if we look at this today, this shows us the different Zoom data centers that we have in the world today. Hosted in AWS, you have these data centers across locations in San Jose, you have in San Jose, you have in London, you have in Toronto, Canada. So for customers that have requirements that data should not leave Canada, for example, we can have your data hosted as Zoom allows you to have your data hosted in Canada. So this is more like a spread of what Zoom data center regions and locations look like today. On the next slide, I'm going to be talking about platform-specific recommendations, right? As we join, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We do have a question here. Is Zoom MFIPA compliant?
Is Zoom and what?
Is Zoom MFIPA compliant?
I don't have an answer to that right now, but I can come back with an answer to that specific participant before the end of this meeting or after this meeting.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So talking about platform-specific recommendation, and thank you, Owen, for mentioning a couple of this. In your slide, there's a way we should take, there's a way we should see our classrooms today, right? There's a school behind my house, and I can imagine me just barging into one of the classrooms to want to sit in to attend a class, right? That is definitely not going to be allowed. Even before getting into the premises, someone is going to ask you, what can I do for you, or where can you be directed to? If I tell them I'm going to go to a class, they will tell you, obviously, you're not registered to this school and you will not be able to attend classes. It's in the same light we should take our virtual classes. Our virtual classes, it's a replica of what a physical class would look like. If I'm in grade 3, for example, I shouldn't be found in a grade 12 class, or if I belong to a different school, or if I'm not a member of a school, or if I'm not a student in a school, I shouldn't be able to participate in classes. And one of the first item on this list is for you to lock your virtual classrooms, right? Once you have all your students in your classrooms, lock your classrooms. What that does is it prevents people that are not authorized to join this meeting from being able to join. For most meeting providers like WebEx and Zoom, you can lock your class meetings when the session has already started so that no one else can join. It is kind of like closing a classroom door after the bell. Give students a few minutes to file in, then click the option to lock the classroom. Now, the question is, how do I lock my classroom? And again, to my point of adoption, this is where adoption comes into place. Regardless of what meeting platform you're using today, right? Regardless of what meeting platform you're using today, they provide options for you to lock your classrooms so that people cannot join. What that does is, what that does from an adoption standpoint is educators are trained on how to navigate these features within the meeting app so that they can leverage them when they need to. The next item on this list is control screen sharing. You don't want anyone to share anything that occurs to them during a meeting. As a teacher during your class, you want to be the only one that has access to the blackboard, right? The only person that would have access outside the teacher are students that have been invited to write on the board, right? So to give instructors more control over what students are seeing and preventing, we need to prevent guests from sharing random content. So control screen sharing is also one of the features that you want to leverage when you're in the meeting. However, when students are working in a group, you can allow screen sharing on a case-by-case basis in the meeting window. This is one of the great use cases, again, of adoption training, where educators need to be properly trained on how to navigate meeting controls. Another thing you want to do is to enable waiting room, right? In some cases, for most meeting platforms, if you have single sign-on enabled, that means anyone within your organization or within your organization will be allowed to join your meeting. So take, for example, we have single sign-on for a school board, for example, right? For a school, for example, that means someone in grade 3 can join a class in grade 4. Why? Because single sign-on allows them to join any meeting within their organization. What you can do in situations like this is to enable waiting rooms. Most teachers, they can identify their students. They know their students by name so that they can only admit students that are supposed to be members of their class into the meeting. So if you when you're scheduling your meeting, you want to enable waiting room, and you also want to say that all participants that will be joining the meeting, except the host and the co-host, would have to wait in a waiting room before they are being admitted into the meeting. Another thing you want to do is to lock down chats, right? You don't want your students bickering while you're teaching, because once chat is open for students to use, it's more like saying people can have side talks during class sessions. So those are things that is another thing you want to take into consideration. And let's say for a minute that you didn't go through all of this security feature, you didn't take all of these precautions, there's also an option for you to remove participants from meetings. Let's say for instance, an intruder was able to successfully gain access to your meeting, maybe because you didn't enable any of the security feature. There's the option, especially in Zoom, for you to be able to remove this participant and bar them from being able to rejoin the meeting. Another thing that is very important is for us to refrain from sharing virtual class information on social media and online. There was a video a friend of mine sent to me yesterday of the Minister of Defense in the European Union having what they call a top secret meeting, and a journalist was able to join that meeting. Apparently, the Minister of Defense for Netherlands shared the meeting information on her Twitter account, and someone grabbed that information and was able to gain access to that meeting. So the same thing is applicable for our classrooms or our class meetings. We don't want to be sharing this information online. If you want to send meeting passwords, for example, to your students, you want to send that to their email address or via any means of communications that you have within your school or school board today. So security options you want to take into consideration when scheduling your class. You want to require registration. If you require registration, it would ensure that only students or only participants that are registered for that particular class would be able to join the class when it starts. Right. You also want to refrain from using you also want to use random meeting IDs. If you use a static meeting ID, it makes you very more predictable, and you will be able to, and people would be able to predict what your next meeting would be. And most of the time, they can easily bomb the meeting. Protect the classroom. You want to create a passcode that you only share with your students via school email, so that only those intending to join can access the virtual classroom. Allow only authenticated users to join, and this is what speaks to single sign-on capabilities, because these users have been authenticated by Zoom to be part of your organization. You can create a situation where only authenticated users can join your meeting. Also, whilst in the meeting control, you want to manage annotation, so you don't want anyone to be able to scribble on your annotation, because these features have been built into Zoom and other meeting platforms so that participants can co-collaborate and share ideas together during meetings. So you want to disable that and only enable that when you need them to be enabled. You also want to disable join before host so that you can control the environment effectively, so that people don't join meetings and do things that you're not aware of before they join the meeting. The last but not the least on this list is control who can speak, leveraging add mute features. One of the features that are being built into most meeting platforms today is to restrict who can speak when they join. Zoom especially allows you to mute all participants upon join, and you can also within meeting controls ensure that participants cannot unmute themselves, which means only users that you want to speak would be able to speak during your meeting. I think I'll pass the presentation back to Jen.
Yep, we'll have Anthony up next. I'll pause with a question here going back to the data center locations. Can we choose the data center geolocation for data at rest?
I would respond to Khalid in the chat.
Perfect.
I'll respond to everyone in the chat, because I think it's an information that everyone deserves to have. So I'll respond to everyone in the chat so that we can have the information. And I would also pick up the question on the first question that you asked.
Perfect. Thank you. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks a lot, Jen. So with virtual classrooms being so prevalent now because of COVID-19, obviously there's a lot of needs that schools have, especially when it comes to what Alistair, Owen, and Tolu alluded to in relation to privacy and security. So a few needs that have arisen is, of course, we know that schools need to ensure they follow best practices for privacy and security to protect the personally identifiable information of not just students, but of course, everyone involved in the virtual classroom. And as mentioned already, schools in Canada are subject to different privacy laws. So an example, obviously in Ontario, would be the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, otherwise known as MFIPA. And of course, it's different in different provinces across Canada. There's going to be specific privacy laws that apply to those jurisdictions. So why does that matter? Well, failure to protect the PI of individuals involved in virtual classrooms could lead to a privacy breach. Privacy breaches, we know, can result in harm to individuals, identity theft. Very importantly, it could damage the reputation of a school. So there's a whole host of problems that can come from not paying attention to privacy, not ensuring security of information and protecting the PAI of those individuals involved in virtual learning. Next slide, please. So how can a school now identify how well it's protecting the privacy or security of sensitive personal information? Well, one offering that CDW does have is a privacy impact assessment. And basically what that is an analysis of the privacy practices of an organization to identify risks to PII and the impact to the organization. So we've already talked a lot today about operational technical controls that we can use to secure the tool, whether it's Zoom, whether it's Teams, whether it's Google Chat. We can configure these tools securely, but that doesn't automatically mean everything is taken care of. The way that a school handles personal information, which involves many practices that have nothing to do with the tool itself, that also comes into the picture as well. So it's the idea of defense in depth. Definitely, you want to have the technical controls in place and you want to have the tool configured securely. But at the same time, you want to layer that as well with administrative controls. What administrative policies and practices are managed by the school to ensure that privacy controls are put in place, like obtaining consent from the guardians or the parents, like ensuring that when a parent or guardian asks to see their private information, that the school is able to easily provide it to them, because that is a requirement that they may need to adhere to. So it's a combination of the technology and the practices at the school that are very important to work in concert together in order to really protect information. And that's what a privacy impact assessment, that's what a PIA can help to do. It can help the school to understand how well it's implemented its current privacy practices. So some examples of privacy principles that could get assessed in a privacy impact assessment. You see some of them here on this slide. For example, accountability. I'll just speak to a few of them. Accountability, having somebody who is accountable, responsible to speak on behalf of the school to address privacy issues, privacy complaints. Who's going to respond to that? Somebody has to be assigned and designated to be that individual. Number 3 on the screen there, consent. Obviously, that one is very well known, making sure that we obtain consent from guardians, from students, if they're old enough, and making sure that we have that recorded so that they're aware of what we're using their information for. Number 4, limiting collection, only collecting the information that we need to. We don't want to collect any more information than what's absolutely needed for the purposes that the school requires. Number 7, safeguards. So in PPM 164, it doesn't go into too much depth, but it does mention some security safeguards that could be in place. And from A to E, you see them there, having a password security policy in place, making sure you have a process for proper user ID registration. C, standard operating procedures for the initiation, duration, and closure of classroom sessions. D, communication of acceptable use and appropriate conduct, making sure that that's communicated out to students, guardians, anyone involved in the class. They need to understand what the rules of engagement are, so to speak, and it's up to the school's responsibility to provide them with that information. And E, security and privacy awareness training, which was spoken of already, making sure that teachers or anyone who is administering these training sessions understands how to use the technology and how to securely operate it. So this doesn't necessarily fully answer the question, but just to help out a bit with what was asked to Tolu regarding MFIPA, being compliant with the legislation is more than just configuring a tool. So of course, we would have to look into that specifically. But to be compliant with the legislation, there would likely be many practices that are outside of that tool that you would still have to conform to anyway. So just that tool alone is not going to automatically mean you're going to be compliant with MFIPA. And then number 9, I'll just speak about that one, individual access. So the concept that when a data owner, so whether it's the student or the guardian of the student, if they want to have access to their information, they want to see what information you have on them, even if it's a recording of a class that the student was in that they presented at, the school has to be ready to provide that information to those data owners. They should be able to have access to that. So these are just typical examples of the types of principles, privacy principles that we would assess in a PIA. It's going to be different based on the specific legislation. These ones are just typical examples. Next slide, please, Jen. So what would you get coming out of a PIA? What would be the output of it? Well, definitely we would provide the details of the assessment, and of course we would provide you with recommendations. If we find any gaps within your privacy practices that don't align with whatever privacy standard that you're trying to meet, then of course we would report those back to you, and then we would also give you recommendations of how you could mitigate them, how you could remediate them. So here I've just listed a flavor of some of the privacy recommendations that we could typically see in a privacy impact assessment. Some of these will overlap with the ones we've talked about already, but of course we'll just go through them. So communicate the virtual classroom services and the potential risks of using these services to students and or parents and guardians in a language that they can easily understand. This is something, of course, that should typically happen before even starting virtual learning. Obviously, we're already in the midst of doing virtual learning, but it doesn't mean that it's too late to still communicate these risks to guardians and or students so that they understand that there are risks that come along with using virtual classrooms. The second bullet, the privacy policy of the school should speak to the specific services being offered to youth, not just privacy in general. So a lot of times privacy policies, whether it's by a school, a business, an organization, many times they just talk about privacy in a very general sense. But when it comes to virtual classrooms, we want to be very specific in the privacy policy and specifically talk to how privacy impacts those virtual classrooms. The third bullet, educate teachers that are operating the video platform for classes on the importance of protecting PII for everyone involved, which we've spoken about already. And in relation to video recording, there are these 6 points here. So of course, the simple one we've already said, don't record videos. If it's not needed at all, simply don't do it. It's less to worry about. Number 2, if you do need to record them, ensure the recordings are securely stored, encrypted, and erased when no longer needed. So you don't want to just keep these for years and years and years. If you have recorded a class, it needs to be stored somewhere securely, and you need to have some sort of retention period to know when you're going to delete that if it's no longer needed. Number 3, ensure consent of a parent or guardian is given, of course, before recordings are taken of any class. Number 4, instruct students and or parents' guardians to limit the viewing range of the camera at their home. Computer should not be placed in an area that would capture the background, everyday interactions of people that are not involved in the class. So you'd want to turn the camera maybe towards a wall, something that wouldn't inadvertently capture someone else in the background who should not be captured. Number 5, hybrid classroom settings. So if we have a setting where there's a teacher in a classroom with physical students, but also that teacher is on camera to virtual remote learners as well, there would have to be some kind of designation so that the students in class know not to come in front of that camera or in its viewing range. So whether the teacher indicates whether it's tape on the floor, there's some sort of barrier so that the students don't inadvertently come into the camera, or if they instruct the students to stay at their desk until the camera is turned off, whatever method they choose. In a hybrid class, the teacher really should only be the one who's on camera, not any of the students that are physically present at the class as well. And then finally, number 6, have a process in place to give students and or parents, guardians access to video recordings of classes. Anyone captured on video must be given access to those videos upon request. It's their personal information. And that's why it's such a tricky thing when we collect information or a recording whether it's voice, audio, video, whatever the case is, it's natural to think, well, I saved this on my machine, it's mine, I have it now, or it's the school's. No, it's not. Whoever's image is on that, it's theirs. So we need to be prepared to give them access to that information should they require it. So to kind of sum this up, what does a privacy impact assessment do? It says there in the red text on the right, a PIA will help a school to understand the maturity of its privacy and security practices and provide recommendations to enhance those practices where needed. And that's a great starting point for a school to set up a roadmap of how it's going to mature its privacy and security program over time in order to secure virtual learning. That's everything for my section. Back to you, Jen.
Excellent. Thanks, Anthony. So going back to adoption on those on all the controls and features discussed today, CDW is partnered with Logix Academy. They're a Canadian leader in implementation and training support for the education community. Their experienced team runs webinar sessions. They've had a number of pre-baked sessions running through the fall. They can also customize, and those can range from remote learning tools, Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, Minecraft, and more. Trainings are offered in both French and English, and again, they can be designed for your specific school needs. So you can contact your CDW account manager for more information on those offerings. And then just a reminder about some of the resources we've designed to support our education institutions, also students and parents. You can check out our cdw.ca Learn From Home page for special offers, for recommended classroom or learn from home products. We've tried to narrow that list down to available or available in short order products. Again, we're going to package all this information with this deck for you and distribute it out, so you don't need to take any notes there. You'll also find our virtual and hybrid classroom readiness checklist from that page available for download. We're going to share it with you. Addresses digital access software that supports student engagement and safety. And actually, Alistair on the call today has also authored a couple of pieces on our Experts Who Get It blog that goes into a little bit more detail around some solutions available, some software available to support those ideas. And then we've also co-developed with our partner KnowBe4, which you can think of as standing for Know Before You Click. We've developed a cybersecurity awareness package with a page for educators, a page for students, and for parents. So this includes really easy to follow best practices, but also points to other external resources such as RCMP resources for educators, getcybersafe.ca, Stop a Bully Canada, and more. So this package can be, we'll share it with you following this session, and it is designed to be ready for distribution with none or at least very minimal touch required from boards or institutions. So just a few quick call outs there. And outside of that, we are ready to take any further questions.
Hi, Jenny. This is Tolo. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm or to clarify how to answer the questions on data at trust. So when I mentioned during my presentation that Zoom allows you to select data centers in which you want your traffic to go to, that would be for data in transit, which would be for data for meetings and data for webinars. For data at rest, right, your data center will be your own region data center. In this case, for customers in Canada, that would be data centers in Canada. So I will, in the question and answer panel, share a link that talks more about this and in full details.
That's great, thank you. There's another question here. In future, if there's an opportunity in our environment, can CDW help us sign a contract with Zoom if we include our own clauses in it and both parties agree? So the end user licensing agreement is signed directly with Zoom, at least to my knowledge. So certainly as a partner to you as our customer and a partner to Zoom, we can support that engagement. We are a Zoom authorized reseller as well, and for our public sector customers, we offer Zoom through our OECM contract in Ontario. So I think, you know, to dig in, we might have to dig into that one a little bit more offline in terms of what you're looking for in terms of support, but we're happy to have a conversation.
The other question I had was for the MFIPA, right? I don't have any publicly available information. I don't have any information myself regarding that because I don't have any information, and I probably would check with I'll check with Zoom to see if they're certified for this, and I will try to get the information of the participant or the attendee that asked that question so that we can respond directly. Or maybe we could just share this information as part of the other documents that will be going out to attendees, because this might just be useful for everyone down the road.
Okay, I think there are no other questions coming in. Thank you so much to all our participants that joined us this afternoon. Again, you'll receive this recording, the deck, as well as the other content mentioned throughout the session. And thank you to all of our presenters today. Have a great afternoon.